Welcome to Lesson 4, Introduction to Classes, Objects, Methods, and Strings. Now this lesson is going to be your first full introduction to the basics of object-oriented programming in C#. If you're coming from another object-oriented programming language, you'll see a lot of concepts that you already know, and your main focus here will be on learning the syntax of how to create classes and objects in C#. Now we're going to start with a discussion of how to declare your own class and then create and use objects of that class. A class is basically modeling a real-world concept. So for example, if you're working inside of a company has lots of employees, and if you were creating software that was for managing those employees, one of the classes you might create is an employee class, and that might have information associated with it, such as the employee's first name, last name, social security number, etc. So one of the key things that we do when we're building object-oriented programs is create classes that model real-world concepts that we then use in our apps. So we'll start by showing you how to create a class and then use it to create an object and interact with that object. And as you build classes throughout this lesson, we're going to be associating with those objects, or those classes, what we call attributes and behaviors. Attributes of an employee are things like the first name, the last name, and the social security number. And behaviors are functions in other languages, or methods as we call them in most object-oriented programming languages, that designate a task to be performed using the data that's already part of a given object. So for employees, for example, if I'm creating a payroll system, let's say that every employee gets a fixed weekly salary, we might have an earnings calculation that returns that fixed weekly salary. When we get into more robust programs in later lessons, specifically in Part 2, we're actually going to create a bunch of related employee types and do different earnings calculations for each type of employee, at which point we will obviously have different calculations based on the type of employee. So a fixed weekly salary for one type of employee and maybe an hourly salary for another type of employee. Those things are attributes of the employees that we're manipulating, and again, the methods use that data to perform a task such as calculating an employee's earnings. So we'll take a look at how to implement methods for behaviors of a class, how to define what are known as instance variables to model a class's attributes. And the reason we call them instance variables is because once you have a class and you create objects of the class is kind of like a blueprint and the objects are kind of like houses made from the blueprint. Every single object you create has its own copy of those instance variables. So every instance of the object has its own copy of the instance variables, and we'll focus on that concept in this lesson. We'll show you how to invoke or call methods on a particular object to tell that object to perform a task for you. We'll also focus on some of the differences between local variables inside of a method and instance variables inside of a class. And one of the key differences is that any variable you declare in a method lasts only as long as that method is executing, whereas variables that you declare in a class, so-called instance variables, last as long as the object that contains them exists in the runtime system. So we'll talk about what that means and how those differ as well. And then finally, towards the end of this lesson, we will discuss a concept called a constructor. When you're building objects of a class, one of the things that you generally want to do is make sure that those objects data are fully initialized from the moment you create the object. And one of the benefits of doing that is it helps prevent errors, because if you've got fully initialized data that's been validated properly, you can then just start interacting with that data, not having to go and check to see if the data is valid in advance. And we'll show you some of the software engineering benefits of working with classes as we work our way through this lesson. Constructors are the mechanism that you use to ensure that an object gets initialized from the moment it exists in the system. As you're working your way through this lesson, if you have any questions at all, please feel free to contact me. And generally the best ways to reach me are through my email address, which you see on the screen, or through our company Facebook and Google Plus pages.